Welcome! Are you struggling creating great sounds on your synths? Fear not, because here are 5 synth programming tips for beginners in the Vital Synth. If you like my channel and content, you can support my work by buying a sample or preset pack at my marketplace. I actually have a preset pack for the Vital Synth called Omega Vital Presets Pack, with a growing set of 80 plus really nice, sweet sounding patches. Right, so with the basic patch in the Vital Synth, we only have a single oscillator, a sawtooth, which is in itself is quite boring. So the tip number 1 here is to add the Unison function. Take hold of one V here and drag it upwards, so we add 8 voices of Unison. That means that we have 8 copies of the exact same oscillator. And to the right side we can control the amount of detuning for all these oscillators. So by default it's set to 20%. Which is quite much, because it starts to sound a little bit too out of tune. You usually want to have this around -5 to +20. Now when you start to add oscillators, you can quickly see that we clip the audio here at the level readout. So what you usually do is either drag down the volume or drag down the master volume for the plugin. So let's drag this to -12. -12 dB, so we're in the safe zone. In the Vital Synth you actually have tons of options to control the unison spread. So let's go to the Advanced tab. Here we can control the stereo of the unison. So depending on the sound you're after, you can either have a very broad and spread sound, or a quite mono and focused sound in the middle of the stereo field. Okay, so for tip number 2, we need to add some kind of movement into the sound, because it sounds quite static at the moment. Nothing really happens to the sound. To introduce a movement, we can make use of the LFOs, or the low frequency oscillators. So just take hold of an LFO like this and drag it to the level of oscillator 1. And we can control the frequency or the speed of the LFO. In this particular patch we're going to bump the volume to around 0 dB and drag the modulation to the left side, so we're modulating to the minus side of the volume, of the initial volume level. You can also control the modulation on the LFO itself. So you can see the amount there that we're modulating. But we're just going to add a tad of modulation. Like so. Now for tip number 3, we're going to add some layering and stack up some additional oscillators to the sound. So we activate oscillator 2 and click the arrow to the right, so we go to the classic blend. And now we can use this little parameter knob and convert this into a square wave. So now we can mix that oscillator into our sound. Now to get a more interesting sound, we add a little bit of movement to oscillator 2 by using LFO2. So take hold of LFO2 and drag that to the level of oscillator 2. And let's drag down the modulation a little bit. Pay attention that you can actually see the movement of the LFOs if you look to the left side of the LFO names. So LFO2 is moving a little bit slower, half the speed of LFO1, but that's a nice thing for this particular sound. Now to make oscillator 2 a little bit more interesting, we can add an oscillator effect. And that's these 2 parameters. So let's press down here and add formant. And you can hear that the sound becomes a little bit sharper. We will add some more movement to Oscillator 2, adding LFO2 to the panning. Like so. So it moves to the left and right side of the stereo field. Let's deactivate the Oscillator 2 briefly here and talk about a very important thing regarding the LFOs. If you look at the LFO1, we have the trigger mode, which means that for each key we press, we fire basically a new LFO. And that means that if you press the keys at the same time, all the LFOs will fire at the same time. But if you press them sequentially, you can hear that we get this kind of weird beating because all the LFOs are in different times. They are offset differently. You can change that if you want by changing the mode to sync mode. Now, no matter what kind of sequence we press the keys, we will still have the exact same sync as the DAW tempo. But for this sound we're using the trigger mode. Now let's add an additional layer, so we activate the sampler down here, which is currently set to a white noise. So we get a little bit of high-end sizzle to the sound. But let's change that to some other kind of noise sound. The part is quite interesting, like a wind kind of sound. We also activate the key sensitivity so that it is pitching the sample according to the key press. Tip number 4 is to play with a filter. So let's activate the filter 1 down here. And by default it only affects oscillator 1, so it can sound a little bit weird by default if you have multiple oscillators. But you can easily fix that by just activating the filter for oscillator 2 and also for the sample. And we add a little bit of key tracking, so the filter opens up as we go higher up the keyboard range. Now we need to add some movement as we did with oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, so we drag envelope 2 to the filter. And introduce a little bit of attack to the envelope, and drag down the sustain slightly, and increase the decay to around 3 seconds, and a little bit of release. So now the filter opens up according to our envelope, but it's opening the sound a little bit too fast, so let's drag down the modulation amount. Let's attach a LFO2 to the sampler also. And just make it modulate the level for the sample a little bit. Now the tremolo on oscillator 1 is a little bit drastic, so let's drag down the modulation a little bit. So we just have a few subtle movements on these different parts. For this sound we can also adjust the master envelope, which controls the amplitude for the overall sound. So let's increase the attack slightly, decrease the sustain a little bit, increase decay, and increase the release to 0.4 seconds. Now let's quickly add some effects to make this a more full sound. Introduce the compressor, which is quite heavy at the moment, so drag down the mix. So just a little bit of compression. Introduce the delay and set it to a ping pong delay, and drag down this spread because it can easily get overboard. We can also change the frequency of the left side to quarter notes. Add a little bit of reverb, increase the time slightly, decrease the mix, make a little bit of low cut because in reverbs you often want to get rid of the low end so it don't muddy up your sound. Now for tip number 5, as icing on the cake, we need to add some expressiveness to this sound, so we can control it with maybe the mod wheel of our MIDI controller. And for that we're using the macro function of the Vital Synth. So drag the macro to the filter, so we can open up the filter with our macro. Maybe decrease the amount a little bit. Maybe attach the macro to the level of oscillator 2. And also to the level of the sample. And remember to drag down the amount that we modulate with the macro. Now we can actually bump the master volume a little bit here, because we can see that the volume is quite low. Now to be able to control the macro with the mod wheel, we can just drag the mod wheel modulator up to the macro. So now we can be more expressive with our sound, so we can control it with the mod wheel. And maybe also add the macro to the formant, to control the formant with just a tad. Let's adjust these parameters slightly. The LFO2 will affect the sampler just a little bit on the level, but the macro 1 will modulate it a little bit further. Now as a bonus, let's just add a third oscillator. So let's activate oscillator 3, drag it to -12, and make that into a square.